Based on a Boo story, turning unexplained experiences into ghost story gold. I'm your host, Deb Lerew. Most people have had at least one brush with something they could not explain. An eerie voice in another room when no one else is at home. A strange light in the sky. A fleeting glimpse of some unknown creature in the woods. I suspect that the majority of people tuck those experiences away in the depths of their minds and never give them another thought. Or maybe they deny the experience ever happened. However, other people, like myself, never forget those experiences, no matter how brief they might have been. Some of us continue to think about them for months, years, or even decades. And some of us turn those experiences into stories in our minds, stories that dare to ask why and what if. I had my first ghostly encounter when I was 4 in an old brick Victorian duplex in the bedroom I shared with my brother. As I lay awake one night, I looked toward the foot of the bed, and there she stood, an elderly woman in 19th century attire, just staring at me. I sat up to ask who she was, and she vanished. I never saw her again, and I never found out who she was, but I never stopped thinking about her. 50 years later, I still find myself wondering about her story. I've been unable to find any relevant information about either the woman or the house in the years since that occurrence. So I created endless backstories for that woman. Maybe she was a lonely widow. Maybe she was a mother grieving a child who had died in that room. Or maybe she was an elderly spinster who had died with some kind of guilty secret. Eventually, that brief encounter became the seed that grew into my first published novel, The Newbie. In that novel, I fictionalized my encounter and I used it as a springboard to launch my protagonist, Kyrie Carter, into the world of paranormal investigation, empathic abilities, and eventually time travel, as she tried to understand a world that she regularly experienced, but others often could not see. As one book became 2, and then 3, and then a series, other personal paranormal experiences found their way into those stories, as did a few college ghost stories, Native American legends, and pieces of Clinton County, Pennsylvania folklore that I've found interesting. So what is my process? How do I take a simple, fleeting experience and turn it into a short story or a full-length novel? How do I inject an interesting bit of local folklore into my novel and make it my own? But those are some of the questions I'm going to address during our about half hour together today. And I hope it gives you some useful tips to help you pen your own paranormal novel. For the most part, my process begins with the same story building principles that writers of any other fiction genre use: plot, setting, characters and conflict, tone or mood, and theme. But when I decide I want to include a personal paranormal encounter in one of my stories, there are a few general questions I consider before I even begin writing my story. First, how big of a role will my personal paranormal experience play in what I'm writing? Am I going to turn that encounter into a full-fledged short story or novel? Or will I just use it as inspiration? In other words, will that encounter be the whole story? part of the story, or just seed for a story? Second question is, how true to life will the portrayal of that paranormal encounter be in my story? If you think about it, sometimes if you have a paranormal encounter, whether it's with a ghost, a UFO, or whatever, sometimes that occupies a lot of your thoughts and it really makes an impression on you. And if you decide to write about that experience, you might want to make it the main focus of your book, and you may decide you want to do a straightforward, almost factual retelling of that experience, complete with the history of the actual location where it occurred, and maybe the reactions and shared experiences of others around you with regard to that experience. Now, that method of storytelling does have validity. What you need to keep in mind, however, is that there's often a fine line between telling the true story of what you experience, which would be nonfiction, and writing a based on a true story piece of fiction. So if you're interested in nonfiction, that falls under the guise of memoir or creative fiction. So if you're interested in heading in that direction with your story, shoot me a message and I'll give you some tips and resources to get you started with that. But for today, we're just going to focus on fiction. So with that said, let's move into talking about creating a work of fiction based on your personal experience. Now, if you like, you can make this a little bit interactive. You can call to mind a creepy experience you've had yourself, whether, again, it's with a ghost, a UFO, or maybe Bigfoot or some other cryptid, and begin thinking about that experience in terms of the questions we'll be considering. So we're going to start with plot. One thing to consider with regard to making your encounter part of the plot of your story is the duration of the experience you're writing about. Was your encounter with a ghost, a UFO, or a cryptid just a brief one-time event? Or was this something you had numerous, vivid, related experiences with over a period of time? Obviously, if you're basing your story on something that happened over a longer period of time, you're going to have more of your plot points filled in than if you had a quick 30-second encounter with a shadowy figure in your basement. Another question you want to ask is, what was the nature of your experience? Naturally, seeing just a vague shadow dashing through your basement is much different from an unseen force hurling a chair at you or pinning you up against a wall and attacking you. And that most likely is going to influence the way you use the experience in your plot. Now, my own childhood encounter was brief and overall uneventful, except in the adrenaline of that moment and in my 4-year-old mind. So I didn't have a whole lot to work with. What I had to decide when I was going to include that in my novel was how big of a part that account would play in Kyrie's story. Was I going to expand on it and make a short but vivid flashback scene from her childhood? Or would I expand it further and make it the focus of an entire chapter, maybe something that happened later in her life? Or would I build the entire novel around that ghostly woman? Who she was, why she haunted the house, and how she interacted with Kyrie and her family. All of those options would have been valid, and they all would have made great stories. But what I chose to do was to make that encounter a part of Kyrie's backstory. That encounter was actually her reason for becoming interested in ghosts, and it fueled her desire to investigate not only the ghostly woman, but also other encounters that happened throughout her life. So in the first book, Kyrie recounted that brief encounter with the ghost woman in a story she submitted to a contest that she ended up winning. And that led to her first paranormal investigation with a celebrity ghost hunting team. But then in a later book, I brought that childhood experience out again, and the ghost appears to Kyrie again as she realizes there's a connection between that ghost woman and the ghost of an estranged relative. Both those spirits then appear to Kyrie in dreams and visions to guide her in solving a century-old murder on the property that she inherited from that estranged relative. So, in short, the backstory that was based on my brief childhood encounter was actually paved the way for other storylines later in the series. Now, let's move ahead into setting. So, it goes without saying that a real life encounter that you had obviously took place in a real setting, a real place. But as you're writing your story, you're free to do whatever you want. Are you going to set your fictionalized encounter in the actual location where you experienced it? Or will you maybe move the encounter to another real life location? Maybe you'll make the setting entirely fictional. And a third option would be your setting might be a combination of real and fictional. Now, just like with the plot, whatever you decide to do with your setting is fine. However, there are some caveats to keep in mind when you're using a real place for your setting. Probably the biggest consideration when you're using a real place as your setting is, did your paranormal encounter happen in a public place, like a business, a historical location, or maybe even a well-known road or highway? Or did it happen in a private property, like someone's residence, whether it's yours or someone else's? Obviously, if your experience happened in a public place that is noted for paranormal activity, such as the Gettysburg Battlefield, which is known for apparitions, things like that, or Roswell, New Mexico, which is known for UFO sightings. In those cases, you're not as likely to ruffle feathers by using that real location as you might be if you encountered a ghost in your Aunt Gertrude's house on Petunia Street in Dalmatia, Pennsylvania. Now, that's not a real person or a real place, so don't even bother looking it up. Now, if you're using a real life city or town for your setting, you want to make sure you get your details correct. And this is especially important if you're using a well-known place, say, like, again, Gettysburg or London or Chicago, something like that. On the most basic level, you want to make sure you get well-known place names correct. It may seem minor, may seem like it has nothing to do with your ghost story, but some readers can be very picky about getting a street name wrong or about placing the public library on the wrong side of town. And they may be pulled out of an otherwise well-told ghost story. Now, the same goes for using a well-documented haunted location. Even though you're writing fiction, you want to be careful about turning what is usually a mildly spooky residual presence into a violent poltergeist type haunting. Again, sticking with Gettysburg because I'm familiar with that place. Let's talk about the Jenny Wade house. There's a lot of reports of paranormal activity in that place, but most of it is very mild. Apparitions, maybe the smell of bread baking in an otherwise unoccupied kitchen, or voices, things like that. So if you have an experience like that in the Jenny Wade house, you don't want to take fictional license and turn gentle Jenny Wade into a demonic, violent entity that attacks you in the bedroom or whatever. Again, there are some readers who will really take offense to that, and it won't go well for you as an author. Now, along the same lines, Be careful about saying a real place is haunted if it's not. And this is true whether you're talking about a public spot or just someone's private residence. Even if a rumored haunting is well known and has been talked about for years among the locals, current business owners or homeowners might not want the surge of attention that could result if your book takes off and becomes wildly popular. Just imagine how they'd feel if rabid fans of your book would suddenly show up on the doorstep wanting to do a paranormal investigation of the home or business. Hey, don't laugh. It does happen. Remember the Blair Witch Project movie? Burkittsville, Maryland dealt with the aftermath of that popular fictional movie as tons of tourists showed up looking for the Blair Witch, who, by the way, was a made-up character based on a real person who lived 2.5 hours from Burkittsville. On a more personal level, there's a private property near the place where I grew up that has the reputation of being haunted, and it's had that reputation for decades. The place is not actually haunted. It's isolated and run down, and yeah, it does look haunted, but it's not. And every so often, the local teens revive those ghost stories, and the property owners have to deal with the resurgence of trespassing, people showing up and looking in the windows and trying to get into the house to look for the ghost. So it's just annoying all the way around. So if you're going to base your story on an experience that happened in a real spot, in a real town, you'd best consider talking in generalities and not actually naming the actual place. Keep your description of the location somewhat vague, or better yet, just come up with a fictional business or a fictional side street that doesn't exist as the location for your haunted residence. That way, you don't create unnecessary drama for residents or business owners or for yourself as an author. So in my first book, The Newbie, the ghostly woman appeared to Kyrie in a house identical to the one I had lived in. But I placed that house in a fictional town at a vague address. This way, no one could go to the real house in the real town where my real experience occurred and try to scope out or investigate a haunted location. Now, in subsequent books, Kyrie goes back to her college to investigate some campus ghost stories. The settings in those books have fictional names, but they are heavily based on the real town and the real college that I attended. And some of the ghost stories are close to the ones that allegedly existed on that campus, but I changed enough of the details of the ghost stories and the locations where they occurred just to make them less recognizable, as well as to be able to exercise my imagination about who those ghosts were and why they haunted the campus. Granted, some readers who live in that actual town did recognize the landmarks and the key locations that inspired my fictional places, and some of them recognized a few of the ghosts as well. But for the most part, my readers were not able to pinpoint the exact location. Okay, let's move on to characters and conflict. So the next thing you want to consider is the people who are in your story and the conflicts that occur between them as a result of the paranormal encounter of either the main character or other characters. Now, probably the most important question is going to be, who is the main character? Is the main character based on yourself or on someone you know? Is the main character an adult, a teenager, a child? Is the ghost itself the main character? Now, if the ghost isn't your main character, and in most cases it won't be, does that ghost play an important enough role to be a well-developed dynamic character? Or is it rather flat and two-dimensional? You also need to consider whether the ghost is friendly or malevolent, as well as who can see the ghost, who can interact with it. Can the ghost see and interact with the living, or is it just a residual presence? Again, the answers to some of these questions will be influenced by your experience, and it's your choice how closely you stick to what happened in real life. Again, in my series, the ghost woman was nameless in the first book, and she really didn't have much in the way of personality or purpose. She was just this hazy memory that Kyrie had that shaped the way she thought about the supernatural. However, when the ghost appeared again in book 4, I decided I wanted to expand her character. So I gave her a name, a backstory, and the ability to interact somewhat with Kyrie. Now, there's another ghostly character who has played an increasingly important role in books 5 and 6. And she's a somewhat vague character from a piece of Clinton County folklore, the Swamp Angel. In the limited stories available online about the Swamp Angel, she has a minor bit of backstory in that she's a Native American maiden who died under tragic circumstances. But beyond that, she's nothing more than a two-dimensional ghostly presence who helps people with paranormal problems. Now, as I did with my ghost woman, I took the Swamp Angel and I gave her a more detailed backstory and a complex personality. She not only helps Kyrie with a particularly difficult evil spirit, but she also befriends her and shares some of her own failures to help Kyrie become a better person and a better paranormal investigator. However, as with any other relationship, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. Some of the things she wants Kyrie to do and some of the ways she chooses to interact cause friction between Kyrie and her family and friends. And Kyrie also has a lot of internal conflict because the Swamp Angel begins asking her to do things that go against her beliefs. So those are some things you can think about with characters in conflict. What kind of conflict does your paranormal encounter cause for the main character? Think about how the different characters react and how their particular beliefs add to the conflict. Now let's go into tone and mood. How scary do you want your novel or your short story to be? Remember, it's not only the things that happen to your characters in any given setting that make the story scary. Your word choice, your descriptions, and the way your characters interpret and react to things that happen help you to convey a tone or a mood. Now, tone can be a lot of fun to play with, and it's something that can and should shift throughout the story to give it depth. We're going to look at a couple scenarios here. In the first one, the paranormal experience starts off as kind of playful and innocent, maybe just something the main character is kind of curious about. Hey, what's going on here? So the story has kind of a light, spooky, fun kind of tone. It's kind of like on Halloween when you go into a haunted house. You know it's going to be scary, but it's not too scary because it's just fun. But then things take a sudden turn in the story, and then the tone becomes dark and scary. And, there's a lot of danger involved. A lot of horror movies and books use this tactic to lull the viewer or the reader into a false sense of security before they unleash the demon, the monster, the serial killer. Now, on the other hand, you can start off with the character being absolutely terrified of this paranormal experience they're having. And they think their life's going to end because this is so dangerous and so scary. But then at some point, the tone shifts, either by the experience being debunked think Scooby-Doo. Or maybe the character discovers that, hey, the ghost isn't really malevolent, there's just an urgent need they have. So the main character helps the ghost with whatever it is they need help with, and that lets the ghost rest peacefully. So then your tone shifts into something that's less dark and less scary. Now, here's something you might not have thought about. We're all environmentally conscious, right? We're into recycling. You can also recycle your paranormal encounter by including it in different stories. And all you have to do if you want to do that is change some of the details and alter the tone of the encounter you had. I've done this with an experience I had in a cemetery when I was a teenager. I was able to use it in two different stories, and I was able to change kind of the timbre of that paranormal experience just by writing stories with different tones and moods. So the real experience involved me taking a dare and walking into a cemetery after dark. Because my cousin and I had been telling ghost stories, I of course had ghosts on the brain, so as I walked into the cemetery, I was aware of all the shadows and the spooky noises going on all around me. So when I heard a flutter and a whoosh right above my head in the dark, I naturally thought some ghoul was after me and I took off running. So after I calmed down and thought about it for a while, I thought that was a funny experience that would make a great story or two. So I first used the experience in a children's short story, which again started off with that spooky tone, like something really scary is going to happen. And then it ended as a funny story when the ghost turned out to be not a ghost. So later, I reimagined the encounter and I used it in the Newbie, which of course had a darker, spookier tone because Kyrie's ghost was quite real and quite unfriendly. So in real life, the ghost turned out to be just a colony of bats that kind of swooped down out of I don't know where. For the children's story, I decided bats didn't work, so I made the ghost be an owl that swooped down from a tree and frightened the main character. And I also added in that something grabbed her from behind, which turned out to be a police officer who then escorted the main character out of the cemetery. And then again, in the Newbie, the ghost is real, and um, it's more of a scary, dark tone because the ghost has a guilty secret that he does not want Kier to find out about, so he attacks her. So that's just one way that I use the same real life, semi spooky encounter in two different ways, in two different stories that had vastly different tones and outcomes. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is theme. So, when someone asks you, what is your story about? How do you respond? Most often, we focus on the plot, don't we? The action in the story. Or maybe we focus on the characters, what they go through in the story, and how they change or grow as a result of what happens to them. Usually, when you talk about your paranormal encounter with a friend or relative, your goal is to tell them what happened, what you experienced, and maybe how you felt about it. And most times it doesn't go beyond that. Now, if your friend is more the curious type or maybe the analytical type, they may want to try to find out the whys and the wherefores of what happened, but that doesn't usually happen. So the same thing often happens with our writing. In most cases, we direct our energy into the plot and the characters and the conflict between the characters. And usually theme only emerges as the story progresses. When I was first writing my story and thinking about how to include my paranormal encounter, I wrote it as a simple ghost story in which Kyrie sent in her encounter to the contest, but then she didn't really give a lot of thought to that childhood encounter anymore. Instead, her focus turned more to the malicious spirit that haunted the house that she and the team were investigating. So I didn't give a whole lot of thought to theme. The story's theme in that case was just straightforward good versus evil and nothing more. And there was nothing wrong with that. It was a good story the way it stood. However, when I went through the editing process, my editor realized that there was more depth to the story, both for Kyrie as the main character and for me as the author. Because I had told her at that time that I was wrestling with how others interpreted my response to the story or to my encounter. She encouraged me to explore that a little bit in the story, have Kyrie wrestle with the same things. And as I did that, as I rewrote the story, the idea of Kyrie finding her identity kind of emerged as a secondary theme as she tried to figure out her abilities and her encounters that she'd had throughout her life. And the story had more depth and meaning because it had that additional theme. And the theme of finding your identity has carried through the series as Kyrie continues to understand her supernatural experiences and her role as a paranormal investigator. And as she interacted with her family throughout the later stories, the themes of family relationships and even belonging have also emerged. So, as you weave your own supernatural experiences into your paranormal fiction, think about maybe how your real life response to your experience might influence your novel's theme. Is there something you're trying to work out in your own life with regard to the supernatural by writing your novel or short story? Now, if not, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with just telling a good story. After all, that's what we authors do, isn't it? But writing a story can also be very cathartic, and it can help you work through issues you're dealing with, and it can help you understand not only yourself, but also the unexplained experiences you've had. I've often joked to friends and family that my writing is a cheap form of therapy. So there you have it. That's just a brief glimpse at the process I use when I incorporate a personal paranormal experience into a novel or short story. As with any other method of novel writing, however, there is no magical formula that will take you from that first spark of inspiration to a completed short story or novel. But I hope you've gathered at least a couple nuggets of advice that will help you turn your eerie encounter into a terrifying tale. Thank you.